Hey everyone, welcome back to this week's video. Today I'm going to be showing you how I painted up and based my brand new Seraphon Army. So let's jump into it. I recently paid a visit to the hobby shop with my partner Z, and while we were looking around, she absolutely fell in love with this Vanguard Seraphon box. And I decided then and there, I'm going to grab this guy. Now there's a bunch of models in here specifically, but I want to make these Kroxigor. Something about them really speaks to me, and I love the Crocodilian aspect to them. They're just really dinosaur-y. I first started by clipping everything out of the sprue, and instead of doing it the traditional way of clipping right next to the model, I snipped a little bit further down on the sprue gate and then just popped the model out. This means that I can come in later and clip them a lot closer to the actual model instead of having like little tags and things from trying to move your hand around in awkward angles. After getting all the pieces that I needed out, I quickly went around and just snipped all the sprue tags off the models. This actually was a surprisingly quick process and left me with little to no cleanup. There was a couple pieces here and there that had a little bit of a notch on it, but other than that, I didn't have to do too much scraping. When it came to assembling, I decided to use some sprue glue, which put simply is just some melted sprue in some Tamiya extra thin glue. Not only does this create a very strong bond, it also fills the gaps at the same time, reducing how much work we have to do later on down the track. Whilst building this guy, I did unfortunately mess up a little bit. I accidentally chose the wrong chest model, so it left a little bit of a gap right here. This is an easy fix if you've got green stuff or milliput, and I have both, but instead of deciding to do that, I went ahead and tried to fill it with sprue glue. Not only was this super time consuming, it took absolutely forever to actually fill in the gap, but I'm pretty happy with the result even though it took me about an hour. I did also decide to build this guy's couple of friends, which I won't be showing how I painted in this video, but you can just replicate the steps that I did on the first guy on these other two. Next up, I started prepping what we needed for the bases. I am fortunate enough to have a bunch of random STLs that I've bought from Epic Basing in my collection. I decided to go for a variety of different things, mostly rocks, branches, ferns, and some destroyed ancient temple things that I found. These are going to all complement each other and give me a decent variety of stuff that I can choose from. I went ahead and grabbed all of our stuff and decided to jump onto the base. Since we're painting the base from scratch, I figured that we'd get that done and dusted. I started by applying a heavy layer of a Growlin' Badland, and thought that I could get away with just pressing all of the basing bits into it, because it's paint. Surely that means everything will stick, right? I did, however, regret not gluing these basing bits down. I figured that the paint would hold it, but unfortunately it didn't, so I had to come back later down on the track, scrape a little bit of the Growlin' Badland out, and then I had to glue the basing bits in just using a little bit of super glue. Other than that, everything was nice and easy. As you can see, I did use a very nasty brush for this. I never use any decent brush for basing things as it's got grit and stuff in it, and that absolutely destroys any of your good brushes. So I highly recommend grabbing a brush that you don't really love anymore and that you can kind of sacrifice to this thing. Now, when I was basing all of these guys, I wanted to create a sort of unique and interesting look that wouldn't take away from the initial model. And as I was doing this, I did make sure to dry fit the model so that its feet were on a somewhat steady base. After deciding on a layout that I liked, I jumped outside and grabbed a couple cans of spray paint. For these guys, I decided to do a heavy zenithal coat so that we can work with some contrast paint later down on the track, and it's just going to save us a little bit of time. When it came to painting the lava effects on the base, I decided to use 3 separate paints. For the initial coat, I grabbed some Evil Sun Scarlet. Then I'd be using some Troll Slayer Orange to layer up from that. And finally using some Uriel Yellow in the various centers to give it that glowy effect. These guys were super simple to make. I started out by sketching the lava flow with Evil Sun Scarlet. The lava bases were some of the simplest basing I've ever done in my armies. I mixed a 1-to-1 ratio of water to Evil Sun Scarlet and started sketching out the patterns that I wanted to go through the base. Now while this paint was still wet, I grabbed some Troll Slayer Orange with the same 1-to-1 mix and sketched over roughly 70% of the initial red that we did. Finally, while that Troll Slayer Orange was a little bit wet as well, I came back with some Uriel Yellow for the final highlight. I focused this towards where the areas would be super deep and then branched it off a little bit. And as you can see, it's all done. To finish off the bases, I did grab some Dawnstone and my little dry brush here. As you can see, it's just a little El Cheapo makeup brush, but it does the job perfectly. I did make sure to put this on my palette, get all the excess off, and just gently dry brush over everything, bringing out all the details of the base. And with that, we're all done and time to jump on to the actual Kroxigor. Next up, I decided to grab some Flesh Tear Red contrast, and I mixed this roughly 3:1 of water to contrast paint. I wanted this to be super watery so that I could build up the red over the carapace. As you can see here, it's nice and thin. I did actually forget to start recording, so that's why I've half started it. I just applied this to all the kind of chitinous areas and scaly areas. Specifically with this army, I wanted to create a bit of a story behind it. When I bought this, my partner Z said you need to make a cool backstory for these guys. So on the car ride home, we decided to make a little bit of a story behind these guys. Now with the red, I slowly built up it over 3 layers and getting slightly more concentrated towards the center of each area. As well as to break up the skin between the nice red and the very stark white, I just drew little patterns as you can see here, mostly dots, little wiggles and things. It just makes it feel a lot more natural and less pedantically planned out by a painter. These Kroxigor have been fighting the Chaos Dwarves in their own jungles, and unfortunately are losing the battle. Lava has flown all through the jungle and their ancient temples are slowly being broken down. We kind of justified the paint scheme by saying that all of these guys initially start out as whatever color they are, whether it be red, blue, yellow, green. And as they battle and get scars, the new skin comes back with absolutely no pigment. Next up, I wasn't super happy with the white on these guys. I originally was going to leave it, but I decided to grab some white gray from Vallejo and just carefully layer it all over the skin. I feel like this kind of tied the model in a little bit nicer and made it feel a little bit more natural instead of just being a bright white skin, which doesn't really happen naturally. I did also make sure to focus these highlights towards the top of the model as it just replicate the light a little bit better. I did quickly grab some Screamer Pink and just went over the entire jawline as well. It doesn't really matter if you get this on the gums and things. It doesn't really matter if you get a little bit messy with this one. You can just come back later and clean up with the white gray. And if it's on the teeth, we'll come back later with a bone paint and do those teeth. When it comes to gold, I don't do mine in the traditional way. Usually what I'll do is I'll grab some Mournfang Brown, some Retributor armor, and mix it roughly 3:1 of Mournfang to Retributor armor. This gives me a solid base coat and adds a bunch of depth when we move on to the next steps. So I just went around the model and picked out any parts that would be gold. Super easy, there's not a ton on this model, but it helps separate out all the skin and things that's on it. Now I was having a bit of trouble holding this model, so I decided to quickly scrape the bottom of the feet off and attach them to this base. And then using some El Cheapo super glue, I smacked some on his feet and just held him on his base for a couple of minutes. Now I did actually leave this for an hour to fully dry just so that I didn't come back and snap him off. I did also quickly decide to grab some Vallejo Metal Silver and just briefly went over his staff. For my bone, I like to do things a little bit differently as well. Instead of using like an Ashabti bone and shading it down, I just start with Steel Legion Drab. I decided to go around the entire model and just pick out any details that we bone, like these things on his hammer and his teeth right here. As you can see, I don't paint in a very linear way. Next up, I decided to grab some Black Legion contrast and did the same 3:1 mix. I made sure to focus this towards the very center of all of our red areas. I then came back with some Retributor armor and decided to jump onto the golds, just layering up in any areas that aren't in shadow. And then for the final highlights on this guy, I slowly mixed in a bunch of Vallejo Silver, and as you can see, just picking at the very top details. Using some pale sand mixed with our original Steel Legion Drab, I decided to go around and then pick out all these bone parts for their final highlights. I think I slowly mixed in roughly about 50-50 paint to begin with, and then increased the level of pale sand that I had for each. Now the final step on these guys was to pick out their weapons using some Flesh Tear Red. This is super easy and you don't need to go too wild with it, but I decided to do a highlight with some Mephiston Red and Evil Sun Scarlet. As with the Mephiston Red, I focused it towards the center and the upper bits of the model, just to give it a little bit of depth, and then just for the final highlight, I mixed in a little bit of Evil Sun Scarlet and did a very small highlight in the middle of these guys. Now I did almost forget to do the eyes on these guys. I picked up the models, thought they were done, but then saw that they had absolutely nothing going on with the eyes. For these guys, I just used some Tesseract Glow, chucking it in my palette, and then very carefully dabbing in the eyes. For some reason, I felt like green magic would be perfect for these guys since they're super angry and it just contrasts the red very nicely. Now with that, the model was 100% complete and it's time for the big reveal. Overall, I'm super happy with how these guys turned out. They're the start of my very own Seraphon Army and I will be doing more with these guys in the future. I'll probably end up running you through the whole Vanguard box within the following weeks as I do the videos, as well as doing a couple of custom model videos with things that I think will really stand out in the army. Hope you guys all like this video and thank you all for watching. So until next time everyone, happy hobbying. Bye!